So here we are at the beginning structure of a service call. I've confirmed the thermostat's calling for heat. I've come down to the unit, I've looked through the little peephole here, and I've confirmed I have a pressure switch error code. I shut the power off on the furnace because that will reset the code. And then I'm going to turn the power back on to watch the furnace through its sequence and see what happens. But before I do that, I want to share with you a tip that has some years of experience behind it. There used to be a situation that would sneak up on me every once in a while that often had me condemning the wrong parts. It's a simple test to take with a multimeter before you turn the power back on to ensure you never get fooled like I did. I have my multimeter put on the continuity setting, and I'm just going to take each probe and put it on each terminal to make sure I don't have continuity showing a closed switch. The control boards in modern furnaces, they're going to give you two possible pressure switch error codes, either open or stuck closed. But older furnaces don't give you a stuck closed option. They just give you a general pressure switch error. And that's the trap. If we were just to go ahead, not perform that test, turn the power back on the unit, and start watching the sequence, here's what's going to happen. You'll get your call for heat. The inducer motor will start running, but the furnace will just sit there and not do anything else. As a technician, your next step might be to test that switch, and you're seeing it's closed as it should be when that motor is running. So now you're wondering what's going on. Without that test, you're off on a wild goose chase. You're testing safeties, you're testing the hot surface igniter, you're looking at the control board possibly being bad. That test saves you from ever being in that situation. Now here's something about control boards that a lot of technicians don't learn until they've been on hundreds of service calls. Modern control boards and some of the older ones aren't just looking for the end state of a pressure switch being closed when the inducer starts running. They want to see the switch opened first and then close after the inducer starts. So they're looking for two states, open first, then closed. Now, there are a lot of older furnaces out there that really don't care. They're still going to go through the full fire up sequence and start running even when a pressure switch is stuck closed. But that continuity test I showed you can save you from other traps. If you find a switch stuck closed when the system is idle, it can tell you a lot about the intermittent problems you might have when the furnace is running. If you find a switch stuck in a closed position when it's idle, you want to take that hose off the switch, and then you want to go ahead and you want to do that continuity test once again. A switch that's showing closed in an idle state doesn't necessarily mean the switch is bad. There could be other conditions like water in the tubing, ice buildup, strong drafts outside that could be causing a draft that closes the switch that have nothing to do with the switch itself. By removing this hose, you're allowing the pressure to equalize in the switch and reopen. If that's what happens, now you know you need to be looking at draft issues instead of just changing out the pressure switch. Every error code can point to a dozen potential problems, and all of them are distractions but the one that's actually causing our shutdown. Now, we're only about 20 seconds into the actual diagnostic process here, the time it took me to test continuity on this switch. But what you've learned already was how to sidestep the traps and avoid the wrong assumptions that can lead to hours of time chasing down problems that don't exist. 20 seconds of time that can save you an hour. That is the kind of thinking that allows you to move on from troubleshooting to fixing the actual problem within about 5 minutes. Every single step that we take in a diagnostic process is designed to eliminate all the possible problems that could be causing our fault, but are not our actual problem. Checking our error code told us we have a pressure switch related problem and eliminated many others. Testing of the continuity of the switch allowed us to eliminate or not skip over potential problems we may have missed. And now we're going to go through the sequence of operations and watch when this fault actually occurs. That's a piece of information that I could use to start eliminating more problems. Now, I've learned that you can do this in multiple ways at the same time, and this is the perfect opportunity for me to hook up a manometer. We're going to detach the hose from the pressure switch itself, and we're going to put our T on there. And we're going to take another hose coming off of our T, and we're going to go straight into the pressure switch. The other hose is going to go to our manometer, and this is going to measure in inches of water column. Now, what we're looking for here is a rating on the switch itself that tells us when this switch actually opens or closes. And you can see here it says PF negative 0.75. Now, PF stands for pressure failing or pressure falling, depending on who you talk to. But this is the inches of water column that we're looking for in our test. Either way with this test, I'm going to find something out useful. Either I'm not going to see the draft that closes the switch, which helps me eliminate the switch as the problem, or I'm going to find a draft that can close the switch and the switch is not closing, which means I just found my problem. So either way, I'm either eliminating a problem or I'm finding it. Now I'm going to turn the manometer on, and then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to zero it out to make sure it's reading 0. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind here is that when you restore power to a furnace, especially after an error code, the furnace is going to go through a purge cycle first before it goes through its heating sequence. So you're going to see the blower motor turn on and it's going to run for a couple of minutes and then shut down before the heating sequence actually begins. Another thing to keep in mind is if you have a smart thermostat on a system, the thermostat is also off, and when you restore power, it's going to boot back up. And these thermostats usually have a time delay of their own, and it can be pretty long, for about 5 minutes. Now, some of you watching this, I realize you probably already know there's a way to bypass this thermostat down here at the control board by just using a simple set of alligator clips like this. But here's something you may not know. Just as we discussed earlier, sometimes control boards don't want to just see the end state. They want to see the transition. Just like with pressure switches, they want to see it open first and then closed. Some control boards want to see the same thing with the call for heat itself. So if you hook up between R and W before restoring power, the control board might not see that change and will refuse to carry on with the heating sequence. So what we're going to do to get around this is we're going to leave the door off and we're going to put a piece of tape or a magnet over the door switch. We're then going to go ahead, we're going to turn the power back onto the furnace, and we're going to let the furnace go through its purge cycle. Once that cycle ends, we can then go ahead and hook up our jumpers to bypass the thermostat that's in the time delay. Now, everything I've done so far has set me up for the test I'm about to perform next. Earlier in the video, I hinted towards a diagnostic tactic not a lot of technicians learn. A manometer does more than just tell you whether the draft can actually reach the point to close the limit that the switch is set at. The tactic I'm about to explain to you is how to watch the draft over time and kind of plot it in your head on a curve like a graph. And that behavior can be used to determine where in the furnace the fault is actually occurring. All right, so here's the moment I know a lot of you have been waiting for. I'm finally going to flip the damn switch. But just keep in mind that I'm literally only about 2 minutes into this service call in real time. I tested my switch, hooked up my manometer. Now I'm going to turn it on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my eyes focused on this number the entire time till the failure actually occurs, however long that takes. And what I want to do is I want to show you first what a healthy, normal operation looks like on a manometer. So what we're seeing now on a manometer is that the inducer draft motor just started, and you can notice that it snapped really hard up very quickly, well beyond the pressure rating for the switch. I mean, we're nearly double there. What's happening is the furnace is pulling relatively cold basement air around 60 degrees with a high density. And that higher density is going to give us a much stronger draft pressure. You could think of this as like drinking a really thick milkshake through a straw. So now the burners have ignited, and what we're seeing here is the pressure slowly start to drop off because that heat is making the air expand and become less dense. And with that, we have a draft pressure that starts dropping with it. So you could think of this as like the milkshake that melted is completely liquid milk now, and it's much easier to pull through the straw. Now our blower activates, and the density of the air is going to continue dropping as the furnace continues heating up to its normal operating temperature. And this pressure is going to slowly drop off until it stabilizes in a nice healthy little spot right above the pressure switch rating. Now this drop off takes about 2 minutes in real time, so I'm not going to play the whole thing. And if we can imagine all this behavior on a graph, this is what we would see. See in the beginning here, we have that really hard drop off when the inducer kicks on and pulls that high density cooler air. And it's very strong. This is what a strong inducer motor looks like. And then we can see at this bottom point here, this is when the burners ignite. And we see this nice, slow, steady rise as the furnace comes up to temp and the air becomes less dense. And then it stabilizes. And that red dotted line, that is the rating of the pressure switch itself. And this is completely normal, healthy operation. What I want to show you now are 4 distinct graphs. Each one has a unique draft behavior, and each one of these draft behaviors have associated with them certain problems in the furnace that are very typical, which allows us to start narrowing down the list of culprits of what may be causing our failure. So here we have a very slow rise draft trend. You can see the pressure, it creeps very slowly. It might get to the pressure switch rating, but it takes a lot longer than normal. We're not seeing that hard snap. So what this indicates is that there's no hard choke. There's no obstruction in the flue pipe or maybe the fresh air intake on a 90. The inducer just can't move enough volume. And this is usually an indicator that the inducer motor itself is weak. The inducer wheel could be dirty or damaged. Maybe it's an electrical issue. You're not getting the proper voltage. If there is a capacitor on it, that might be getting weak. This can also point to a leak in the inducer housing itself, maybe a bad gasket or some other crack in the housing. But this is not the signs you would see of a secondary restriction or a flooded collector box or water in the vent tubing or anything like that. Next, we're going to look at a trend where it rises very strongly, but it falls short of the pressure switch rating and the switch just doesn't close. So here we see that hard snap when the inducer starts, but it plateaus a little too early. What that's telling us is that the inducer strength is there. It can move the air and it starts off freely, but there's some kind of a fixed static restriction that exists before the inducer. Now, this is going to point to things like a plugged or restricted secondary heat exchanger, a collector box where it's full or obstructed. So we're looking at flooded collector, water-filled secondary, or any kind of water sitting in the internal exhaust passages holding water or debris. We could also be looking at an obstructed fresh air intake on a 90% furnace, pretty much anything before the inducer. So we're not looking at the positive side of the inducer motor where our venting to the outside is occurring, icing on the outside, snow, or anything after the inducer. Now let's look at the draft pressure curve that occurs when you see the dropout after ignition. So we see our pressure rises normally, our inducer motor is doing its thing, the switch closes, ignition occurs, but then the pressure drops off and it stays down. It's not oscillating or bouncing, it just drops right off. This is typically a load problem. Everything's fine when it's cold, but once it heats up, it fails. This very strongly, most often points to exhaust issues. So you might have a sagging 90% exhaust where there's water collection in there, some kind of partial blockage, ice, snow, birds. Now, if you can't find any kind of obstruction in the exhaust, it is possible you can see a restriction in a secondary heat exchanger, but only under a load. So in other words, when the furnace is cold, the air flows through the secondary just fine. But as it heats up and condenses water, the water's not draining out fast enough. But more often than not, this is an exhaust issue. Now, here's one you might see with a lot of bouncing and fluctuating going on. So our pressure, it never really stabilizes. It's constantly rising and falling. This is when you might see pressure switches or flames starting to chatter, do weird things. And this is an intermittent altering of the draft, and that usually means something is moving. And when it comes to furnaces, especially 90% furnaces, we're usually talking about water here. So this could be condensate sloshing around in the exhaust. Hasn't quite built up enough yet to be a hard restriction, but it's enough there to start causing issues. You can have a partially blocked drainage. You could have water pressure that's in the pressure switch tubing itself or a port. And sometimes it might even just be wind. It's the weather outside that wind pressure is pushing back on it and creating that oscillation in the draft. But we're not usually looking at hard, strict internal blockages of some kind. Now, this method is a great compass to help you really make a short list of potential problems. And the more you use it, the more intuitive it becomes, the more helpful it becomes. Now, sometimes you'll have situations where really weird things are happening, but this method usually leads you to the most common problems that lead to pressure switch error.